Welcome to the Global Events Podcast. We take your sources, articles, research, maybe even our own notes, and we really dig in to pull out the essential insights. Our goal is simple. Get you properly informed, maybe with few surprising details, without you drowning in information overload. Today we're tackling something really complex, quite critical actually. We're looking at global events drawing mainly from Al Jazeera English reporting, specifically events that could seriously reshape the Middle East and maybe even beyond. Our mission is to unpack these pretty stunning declarations made at a recent NATO summit. They touch on the very, very delicate relationship between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. We'll explore the claims made by, a key world leader. We'll look at the counterclaims that popped up almost immediately, and crucially, the huge implications all this has for stability in the region. So get ready, because this is definitely a developing situation. Lots of surprising stuff here.
Absolutely. And what makes this so fascinating, I think, is where these really critical discussions actually happen. You've got this NATO summit, right? Primarily focused on European defense spending, alliance unity, collective security. And suddenly, the spotlight gets completely stolen by these simmering tensions between major Middle Eastern powers.
Right. It just shows how interconnected everything is.
Exactly. It's a real testament to how global security works, or doesn't work sometimes, how quickly things can shift based on what one leader says, and how these, supposedly regional issues can just instantly ripple across continents. We'll be looking closely at how one particular leader's viewpoint, presented right there at the summit, didn't just challenge the standard understanding. It sparked this immediate, very widespread debate, left a lot of people asking, what does this mean? Short term, long term.
Okay, so let's paint the picture for you. We're talking about the end of a NATO summit in The Hague. Now, the main agenda, the big plan for this summit, was pretty huge in itself. The members, after a lot of back and forth, formally agreed to seriously ramp up defense spending, the target, an impressive 5% of their GDP by 2035.
Which is a big number, a really big commitment.
It is.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just a suggestion. It was a very direct, very forceful response to a demand made quite publicly by former U.S. President Donald Trump. He'd been saying for ages that European allies weren't pulling their weight on defense.
Right. That was a constant theme for him.
So, on paper at least, the alliance put on this united front. Strong statements about solidarity, facing, quote, profound security threats and challenges globally. You'd think that would be the headline, wouldn't you? The defense spending, the unity.
You would. That's the kind of thing these summits are usually about, defining the alliance's future, its commitments. And yet, despite that massive agenda item, something potentially alliance redefining, the conversation just got, completely overshadowed. What was really surprising, and what ended up just dominating the talks, were the recent U.S. military strikes on Iran.
A total shift in focus.
A massive shift. You go from NATO's core mission, essentially Euro-Atlantic security, to this very specific regional conflict. A conflict involving a key member, yes, but outside NATO's immediate usual area of operations. It really caught people off guard.
So it wasn't just a side note then?
Not at all. It wasn't just mentioned in passing. It fundamentally steered the whole end of the summit, the final remarks, the media coverage afterwards. And I think that redirection, it really tells you something about how severe the situation in the Middle East was perceived to be. Even with all this talk about long-term defense strategy, the immediate volatility there just demanded urgent attention.
It certainly did. And it was right in the middle of all this, with defense spending pledges still hanging in the air, that President Trump delivered this really dire warning, raising the possibility of renewed conflict, maybe even devastating conflict. His core message, and he delivered it pretty bluntly, no ambiguity, was that the war between Israel and Iran may reignite. And then he added this chilling little detail. It may happen soon.
Think about that, the weight of that statement coming from him at that venue, a major international security summit. Words there are normally chosen so carefully. This wasn't just some off-the-cuff remark. It was a direct public warning, meant to be taken seriously.
Absolutely. A serious warning about global stability.
And what's really interesting, analytically speaking, is the nuance in his confidence. Or maybe it was strategic framing, perhaps, because on one hand, he did express some confidence, saying negotiations with Iran are the next logical step.
That sounds like diplomacy, right?
A path forward.
Yeah. Suggests the way out.
But then, almost in the same breath, he really stressed that there's still a significant chance the ceasefire may not hold. So it's not like he's declaring peace. Far from it. It's a statement just loaded with caution, with underlying tension, even as he's suggesting talks.
He also talked about the past fighting, didn't he?
He did. He reflected on how brutal it was before. Said something like, they fought very, very hard and very viciously, very violently. Connecting that brutal history with this uncertain present, it really highlights his view of the deep-seated hatred, and the very real potential for things to flare up again quickly and violently. It suggests the root causes haven't really gone away.
And he made it very immediate, that concern. He didn't just talk geopolitics. He posed that direct question, almost rhetorical, but one that hits home for anyone listening. Can it start again? I guess someday it can. It could maybe start soon. That's not abstract theory, is it?
Not at all.
That's talking directly to you, the listener, about a real, immediate possibility of more instability in a region that affects everything: energy, trade, security. It forces you to confront just how fragile he thought the peace was, how thin that line is between things calming down and kicking off again.
Absolutely. And to really hammer that point home, he gave this specific anecdote. He presented it as a, quote, big telltale sign of how close things got, how close the region came to another major conflict. It's a pretty dramatic story. He mentioned this instance where Iran, and these are his words, somewhat, by not much, violated the ceasefire.
Now, that ceasefire itself is interesting, isn't it? It wasn't some formal treaty.
Exactly. That's crucial context. When Trump said ceasefire, it wasn't a signed, sealed, internationally monitored agreement. It was more like a fragile, informal pause in the fighting and understanding. And as we'll get into, a lot of European leaders were pretty skeptical about it holding.
Okay, so Iran makes this alleged minor violation. What happened next, according to Trump?
Well, according to him, what followed was this immediate, major escalation from Israel, he said. Israel had the planes going out that morning, and there were a lot of them, 52 of them.
52?
52 planes. That detail alone just paints this incredibly vivid picture, doesn't it? An immediate, substantial military response being launched. It shows how incredibly tense, how hair-trigger this situation was.
52 planes. I mean, that's a staggering number, isn't it? Just try to picture that. A whole squadron, maybe more, scrambling, armed, ready to go. What does that number tell us about how Israel was preparing to respond?
52 represents a really significant show of force, potentially overwhelming. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It suggests a military poised for immediate, decisive action. It really underscores how seriously they took that alleged violation, whatever it was. It speaks to Israel's known doctrine of preemption, their readiness to act fast against perceived threats.
And then Trump claims he stepped in, pulled them back.
That's the claim. He presents himself as the one who averted disaster. His exact words were, I said, you got to get them back, and they brought them back. They didn't do anything. They brought them back.
And his take on it?
His perception was, well, quite self-congratulatory. He said, thought it was amazing, actually. So this specific story, coming straight from him, it really underlines the incredibly high stakes. And critically, it highlights the direct personal intervention he claimed to have made to stop what he saw as a potential new war. For you listening, this paints a picture of a leader who sees himself as deeply involved, right down in the details, claiming he pulled everyone back from the edge.
So the implication is clear then. This wasn't just some abstract risk being discussed in meeting rooms. It was, according to him, a real near-miss event where his personal instructions stopped a major military clash.
Right. It reinforces his whole narrative about the immediacy of the threat, the severity, and his own ability to control these events.
And it serves as this dramatic setup for his next claims, which were arguably even bigger, the ones about Iran's nuclear capabilities.
Exactly. Which brings us straight to maybe the boldest and certainly the most strategically significant claim he made at that summit. President Trump's declaration about the fate of Iran's nuclear program. He asserted, with just absolute confidence, no hedging, that the American strikes in Iran managed to completely destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities.
Wow. Okay. That is a monumental statement, if it's actually true.
Monumental is the word. And he didn't stop there. He went on to say he firmly believed it will take Iran many, many years to be able to rebuild its nuclear capacity. So not just a temporary setback in his view, but a long-term knockout blow to the program.
A claim like that, if true, it just fundamentally changes the entire strategic picture in the Middle East and really globally. And his confidence, he said, came from where?
He said it was based on intelligence reports that he trusts, along with the intelligence report by the Israelis. And he was very specific in pushing back against other stories that were already out there, stated clearly that he doesn't believe that the Iranians managed to take some of the enriched uranium to safe havens and that the entire program was completely destroyed.
Okay, so not just we hit them hard, but we got everything, including the crucial stuff.
Yes, and that's not just a minor detail. It's a direct rebuttal to the concern that maybe the most critical material, the enriched uranium, might have been saved, moved somewhere safe before the strikes hit.
And why is that distinction so important, the enriched uranium specifically?
Because that distinction is absolutely critical. It matters hugely for anyone trying to figure out what happens next. The enriched uranium, that's the core ingredient, right, for a potential nuclear weapon. If Iran did manage to save some of it, move it to secret safe havens, like some reports suggested, then the claim of complete destruction of nuclear capabilities, that becomes, well, highly debatable.
It leaves the door open.
Exactly. It leaves open the very real possibility of them rebuilding the program, maybe faster than Trump suggested. Future rearmament. Now, if his claim of total obliteration is true, then yes, that's a decisive blow. Changes the whole game, removes a major threat without a full-scale war.
But if it's not true,
then his confidence could be a really dangerous miscalculation. It could lead to a false sense of security, maybe bad policy decisions based on flawed assumptions, and ultimately it could leave the region and the world vulnerable to a threat that's been publicly declared dead. The stakes here for global security, they honestly couldn't be higher.
right. So, against this backdrop, the warning about war, the claim of nuclear destruction, Trump then pivots to negotiations. He presents this path forward, but it immediately raises some pretty fundamental questions about what these talks are really about. He stated that U.S. and Iranian officials will begin negotiations as soon as possible, even pointing to next week. That seems incredibly fast.
Very fast. Moving from major military action and high tension straight into high-level talks like that is unusual. But then you hear his stance on whether they actually need a formal agreement, and it really makes you stop and think, what's the point here? He said, quite frankly, we may sign an agreement, I don't know. To me, I don't think it's that necessary.
That's not typical diplomatic language.
Not at all. He went on, they had a war, they fought, now they're going back to their world. I don't care if I have an agreement or not. That just flies in the face of traditional diplomacy, which usually stresses how vital formal written agreements are. To lock things down, establish clear rules.
Yeah, to make sure everyone's on the same page and there are consequences.
Exactly. His words almost seem to undermine the whole purpose of the talks before they even start. It suggests a real lack of concern for the usual ways international relations are conducted.
And the goal of these talks, what was he actually asking for?
Well, that was also surprisingly narrow, almost simplistic given the history and complexity. His only stated demand was singular and seemingly non-negotiable. The only thing we'd be asking for is what we were asking for before about, we want no nuclear.
Just that one thing. No broader discussion about regional tensions, de-escalation, anything else.
Apparently not, based on that statement. It suggests a very narrow objective, not a comprehensive diplomatic effort to, say, rebuild trust or address the many other points of conflict.
So what does that signal to you, the listener?
Well, for you listening, this perspective is crucial. It suggests a major departure from how negotiations usually work, where getting an agreement is kind of the whole point for stability. It really raises questions. Are these talks a genuine path to a lasting resolution, or are they more like a formality, a way to just underscore this one demand backed up by the recent military action?
It implies he felt he had all the leverage.
It certainly suggests a perceived position of overwhelming strength, where maybe the formal agreement itself is seen as less important than the military outcome, and that's single goal, no nuclear Iran. It hints at a very different kind of diplomacy.
Okay, and this is exactly where we shift from these bold statements into, well, the messy reality, the battlefield of information, where intelligence isn't just facts, it becomes part of a political fight, and nobody agrees on what's true. Because while President Trump was making these claims, many European countries, NATO members, they were, according to our sources, feeling very anxious. They shared real concerns about what they called the fragile ceasefire Trump mentioned. Their worry was apparently quite noticeable at the summit.
And their big question, the critical unknown for them, was pretty basic. What are the guarantees that both the Iranians and the Israelis will respect its terms? You see the difference in perspective there. Trump's saying, I stepped in, it's basically handled. The Europeans are saying an informal pause isn't enough.
They wanted something more concrete.
Absolutely. They emphasize the vital role of international bodies, specifically the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, stressing how important it was to convince the Iranians to start new talks, and, critically, to make sure everyone complies with whatever comes next.
Remind us, the IAEA, they're the nuclear watchdog, right?
Exactly. They're the global body for nuclear cooperation and verification. Their job is to make sure nuclear material isn't used for weapons. So the Europeans insisting on involving the IAEA showed they deeply felt the need for formal, verifiable, internationally approved ways to keep the peace. They firmly believed, as the source puts it, that in the absence of a document either between the Iranians and the International Atomic Agency or between the Iranians and the Americans, it is going to be extremely difficult to maintain peace and stability in the Middle East.
So they wanted formal agreements, verification, not just verbal assurances.
Precisely. That's a core principle in international relations. You need things written down, agreed upon, verifiable.
Okay, so given that skepticism about the ceasefire and the need for formality, what did these same European and NATO allies think about Trump's huge claim that Iran's nuclear program was completely destroyed? Well, our sources say they totally decided to remain tight-lipped, silent, on whether they agreed with the intelligence about the ceasefire holding, and more importantly, on whether they believed Trump's claims about nuclear obliteration.
And that silence wasn't agreement, it was strategic. There was a very clear, you could say, diplomatic reason why America's allies suddenly went quiet on this.
Why? What happened?
They saw Trump furious over the reports by major American outlets who were quoting the leaked DIA report, which said that it was far from being obliterated.
Ah, the DIA leak, the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Right. The Pentagon's main military intelligence arm. They focus specifically on foreign military capabilities, readiness, intentions. Their assessments go straight to the top Secretary of Defense, Joint Chiefs. So a leaked report from the DIA directly contradicting the president's claims about the results of military strikes, especially on something as sensitive as a nuclear program that carries enormous weight.
It suggests disagreement right inside the U.S. government.
Or at least a very different assessment compared to whatever intelligence Trump was citing. This leak basically threw down a direct challenge to the president's public story. And that put the NATO allies in a really awkward spot, didn't it? Caught between their main allies' public statements and this conflicting intelligence assessment.
So their silence was diplomatic caution.
You could say that. A strategic move to avoid getting drawn into a public fight with the U.S. president on something incredibly sensitive and politically charged.
And Trump's reaction to that DIA leak, was it cautious?
Not exactly. His response was forceful, very characteristic. He didn't just dismiss it, he attacked it, called it fake news, said it was coming from media which hates me, even called the sources my enemies, and people with a political agenda.
So a full-throated defense, doubling down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A direct, aggressive rebuttal, trying to discredit any information that challenged his narrative of success. He wasn't backing down an inch.
Did he offer any counter-evidence?
Well, according to the sources, his conviction didn't waver. Time and again, he was repeating the same assertions, claiming they've gone through the documents, they've seen the satellite imagery, and that everything is buried under massive mountains of concrete in what used to be tunnels underground. So this constant repetition, citing evidence he claimed to have documents, satellite photos, that was his way of trying to solidify his version of events.
And he brought in the Israelis again.
Yes. That was a key move to bolster his case. He cited an Israeli intelligence assessment saying explicitly that the Israeli government is now confident the airstrikes by the Americans have managed to cause massive, massive destruction of Iran's nuclear program.
Aligning with Israeli intelligence adds weight, doesn't it?
It does, strategically. Given Israel's very real and long-standing concerns about Iran getting a bomb, by saying, look, the Israelis agree with me, he was trying to lend significant credibility to his claim of complete destruction, especially to audiences concerned about Israeli security.
Which brings us neatly to the political fallout, especially back in the U.S. Our sources point out that this whole dispute over the intelligence sparked by the DIA leak have become a political issue now in the United States of America because that report questioning the authenticity of what Trump said is backfiring on him.
It absolutely became a domestic political issue.
For a leader who had so loudly and repeatedly claimed this huge foreign policy win, this kind of counter-narrative must have been a real problem.
A huge problem. He had been hammering this message home. I managed to make it. I obliterated Iran's nuclear program. It happened under my watch. It's a major success. He framed it as definitive, lasting. Iran, many years from now, will never have a nuclear program. That wasn't just a statement of fact for him. It was central to his image as a strong, decisive leader.
Proof he could achieve things others couldn't.
Exactly. So that leaked DIA report directly attacked that key political talking point. It created a significant problem for him at home. It shifted the whole conversation from, did the strikes work, to, can we believe the intelligence? Can we believe the president?
And that leads us right to the core uncertainty that still hangs over everything. Even now, the sources are really clear about this. This is something no one can decide now, and I think it will take some time before we can establish exactly what happened and whether the program has been destroyed.
It's just not that simple, is it? You can't just flick a switch and verify something like this immediately after military strikes. It's incredibly complex, it's shrouded in secrecy, and it's subject to massive political spin from every direction.
And that critical unknown we mentioned earlier, the enriched uranium, that's still right at the heart of it, isn't it?
It absolutely is. The fate of that material is perhaps the biggest question mark. You have the Iranians claiming they managed to take it to safe havens, saved it, moved it somewhere secure, secret, which, if true, completely contradicts total destruction.
And Trump's response?
Adamant contradiction. No, it was completely destroyed. Full stop. This fundamental disagreement over the most dangerous part of the whole program, it just highlights how incredibly difficult it is to know the truth in these situations. It's so politically charged, so secret.
So for you, listening, what's the lesson here?
I think it encourages critical thinking, doesn't it? It reminds us that in these high-stakes games, you always have competing stories. Each side presents its version as the absolute truth while fiercely denying the others, and it means crucial questions remain unanswered. The full truth about Iran's nuclear capability after those strikes, it's still an open, complex, and incredibly important question.
The claims have been made very loudly, but the reality?
Yes.
Still very much unclear.
Far from settled.
So as we wrap this up, we're left with this really striking, incredibly messy picture of global politics, aren't we? You've got this powerful assertion of a massive military success unilaterally destroying Iran's nuclear program. You have a clear single demand for the future, no nukes for Iran. And then you have these upcoming negotiations where the U.S. president himself seems to question if a formal agreement even matters.
And all of that is playing out against this backdrop of deep skepticism from allies, these directly conflicting intelligence reports challenging the official story, and this apparently very fragile peace that, according to Trump's own account, almost blew up just days before, involving dozens of warplanes.
Yeah, the sources we've dug into really show this critical tension, don't they, between the bold claims of decisive action and the murky, uncertain reality of what can actually be verified on the ground, especially about the nuclear program, and specifically what happened to that enriched uranium.
It's true, the detailed accounts from the NATO summit, that anecdote about the 52 planes being called back, and then these fierce political battles over whose intelligence is right. It just underscores how much uncertainty there is, how many unanswered questions, how much potential for miscalculation still hangs over that vital region. And the ripple effects of this information war, they're huge, shaping how people see things, how countries plan, the whole balance of power.
So, thinking about everything we've discussed, what really stands out to you? What's the most significant detail or insight? Was it that stark warning about war reigniting, the sheer audacity of the nuclear obliteration claim, or maybe this whole messy fight over conflicting intelligence?
It's hard to pick one, isn't it? They're all deeply intertwined.
They are. And maybe the bigger question for you, listening, to ponder is this. How might this ongoing fight over the truth, over whose intelligence to believe, and these very different ideas about diplomacy we heard, how might that fundamentally shape not just future talks, but the actual long-term stability and security of the Middle East?
That's the question, isn't it? Something to definitely keep thinking about as these complex, high-stakes events continue to play out.